Hi, it's Cam here, and today I'm going to be sharing with you Insert, in all caps, as a strategy for reading and comprehension. The book that we're going to be using this with is called Turning 15 on the Road to Freedom, My Story of the 1965 Selma Voting Rights March. And it is by a lady who lived it named Linda Blackman Lowry. She told this to a couple of authors and historians a couple years ago, and they were able to get it written up in kind of a picture book, graphic novel format. It's 129 pages long, but there's very little on each page, so it's a quick read. In between the parts of her story, they've included some really nice black and white illustration. They've got archival photos from the event and lyrics of the songs that were sung during the marches. Because it's won so many awards, there are a lot of resources that teachers can use to incorporate this book into their classroom. You can get them on sites like PBS or from a number of other resource sites just through a Google search. As much as I do, I probably wouldn't have picked this book to teach in Alabama because of the weaknesses within our course of study. It fits within U.S. history, but it's written really for a maybe 13 to 15-year-old audience, and United States history is not taught to students within those ages. So I've chosen to teach it to an 11th grade history class because it's still valuable as a primary source, but to really utilize it, I would not be using it in this state. So to guide you through the structure of the narrative, the first part of the book covers Miss Blackman's experiences growing up in Selma as a Black person during segregation and how she got involved in the civil rights movement. She talks about hearing Dr. King speak at her church, which was a historical event that did happen. There is a picture. In the next part of the book, she gets more involved in the movement. A large part of this goes over her experiences being jailed at a march. And while she's in prison, she hears about the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson. What she talks about after that, accordingly, is her participation in Bloody Sunday, as well as the Selma to Montgomery March. And it ends on a pretty high note, with the marchers having reached Montgomery and the Voting Rights Act passed that August. The final part of the book is a couple short essays that the authors have included on the importance of voting. And then there are biographies of all of the people mentioned who were murdered in Selma during this period. Now here I've included a short video to show you what the book looks like rather than putting pictures up on the screen, so you can see what these illustrations look like. You can pretty much read this page if you're a fast reader within minutes. Each chapter is very short. You can see the black and white photos. Now that we've covered the book, we're going to get into the strategy. So Insert is a strategy for annotating. You know, the classic, you take a pen or a pencil and you write in the margins or on your book, your piece of paper. The strategy stands for, it's actually an acronym, Interactive Notation System for Effective Reading and Thinking. So the process is that as they read, they annotate with a couple symbols that are predetermined, and the purpose of these symbols are to connect the text to their prior knowledge. So, for example, some common symbols that are used with Insert are a check mark, if this confirms what they already knew, a minus, if this goes against what they already knew or thought they knew. They do a plus sign for any new information, or write a question mark if it's confusing. This is very flexible. As I said, those are the most common system, but any teacher or student can come up with their own notation system. You can use different symbols. You can use drawings. One of my favorites is an exclamation point for things that you find interesting to come back to. And then there's also some flexibility in how you can use it as an activity, or using the activity itself as a method for assessment. So for example, You can use this in conversation, have your students annotate the reading on a piece of paper, and then show their neighbor what they've annotated and compare. Or you can have your students use their annotation, look back and see what confused them, and write an essay elaborating on that. The strengths of the strategy are that it's really universal. You can use it with any text. It can be expository, it can be narrative, and it also can be used throughout your student's educational career. So once they learn this system, once they learn how to strategically annotate, they can carry that through the rest of their high school classes and through college. It can also be used as a formative assessment. So because we have these markings, you can see where your students are confused, where they're getting the material. You can see if there's something that they've marked as new that should not be new to them. So you see where they have gaps in their prior knowledge, or if they're just not getting what they should be learning in class. And it also strongly promotes engagement because they do have to physically interact with the text to mark it. And that can be very good for people who are visual learners or people who learn by working with things hands-on, because you can't interact with a piece of paper hands-on the way that you can a science lab. But if you mark it up, that's close to what you're doing. So in preparing for this, I found a lot of anecdotal or like qualitative data supporting annotation as a strategy, but I wasn't able to find too many studies, which I thought was strange until my husband pointed out that we don't like to do studies on children. But I did find one that was super relevant to this. These researchers actually looked at a South Georgia middle school. They surveyed about 250 eighth grade students. They used both pre and post reading tests to measure how much students learned from the reading itself. And they split the classes up into a group in which teachers were trained to use a annotation strategy with their students, and those who were not. So there's both an intervention and a control group in this study. What the students are looking at is historical texts in a social study class. The reading said they got most of these from Newsela. So it is very relevant to what I would be doing with this lesson plan itself. We're mixed classes, so you have your students with disabilities, your so-called regular students, and your gifted students all in the same class. And so for some reason, the control group scores were higher than the test group per se. But overall, those students did see higher scored gains. They actually replicated this twice, and both times for the students who were taught to annotate, the difference between their pre and post test was 3 points higher than the students who were not. I was able to find some other evidence, mostly coming out of Asia, that especially shows the value of annotation for English language learners. So a study coming out of Indonesia used insert as I've just described it explicitly. They were, again, using about 250 eighth graders, pre and post test, had a control group. And the data showed that they had significant improvement when they used the insert strategy on narrative text. In Malaysia, they did a similar study using online notation tools. And these students were in college, but it shows that with guidance, the online notation allowed them to put a lot more structure into their reading, and it deepened meaning because there was also a social aspect to it as they were able to recall their annotations and share them with classmates. To use the strategy with the book Turning 15 on the Road to Freedom, the lesson plan I propose would have students review their prior knowledge and the factual stuff about the civil rights movement before they start. So we would go over, what is going on, like what is Jim Crow, what are the existing voting rights laws with the poll tax, all of those things, what is Bloody Sunday, etc. And then have the students together read, use the insert strategy on chapter 15, where she talks about Bloody Sunday, talk about it with a partner, and then share their thoughts with the class. I've only ever had one paid gig as a historian, and this activity loosely replicates that because I was collecting oral histories from people who participated in the civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa and trying to parse their experiences and how it fit within the broader movement. Students are practicing consolidating and verifying sources like a historian. You're examining what this person is telling you and comparing it with your prior knowledge and the so-called facts. And it also reinforces the difference between primary and secondary sources, which is one of the disciplinary things that we are required to do within social studies. So for example, their textbooks, their lecture, these are all secondary sources. What Ms. Blackman says happened to her is a primary source. Students are required to use a notational system, which, like I said, is something they can use throughout the rest of their academic careers. And the activity is also, scientifically proven to be beneficial for English language learners if you have any of those in your class. And here I've compiled citations for the 3 studies I reviewed. In the middle, you can see this Georgia middle school study. Definitely recommend you read if you're interested in learning more about how to use annotation in the classroom or just want a really good example of scientific research within education. Thank you. So I have said my piece. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.